So a few weeks ago, a YouTube channel called The Nth Review published a video with the title, Urban Planning YouTube Has a Huge Problem. I'll admit that I didn't watch it when I first saw it, but it's done the rounds and I did finally get around to checking it out. So he talks about how YouTubers who cover these topics have done a lot of good, but also may inadvertently be doing a lot of harm. He basically says that the main reason for this is that some creators and channels oversimplify very complex topics and have effectively created a new generation of slacktivism, where people generally have the right ideas and intentions, but aren't given the tools or information to affect actual change in the real world, and are given a kind of polished view of urbanism that doesn't reflect the messy, difficult, and resource-intensive nature of getting things done. Now that's a very basic summary, and if you haven't seen the video already, please do so you can hear it in his own words. I've linked it in the description and up here in the top right-hand corner. I should say at the outset that I'm making this video both as someone who makes YouTube videos on these subjects, as well as an actual planner. I've worked in urban and transport planning my entire career, and I don't say this to be a gatekeeper or say that non-transport planners can't have opinions on this stuff. This is just the perspective that I want to bring to this conversation. So I entirely agree with what he says about urbanist YouTube generally being a force for good. As a professional in this field who's watched this happen, it's been fantastic to see so much interest in something that was previously not nearly as well known as it is now. As usual, I want to tie this back to a little bit of history so we can understand why this is the case. Planning is a relatively recent profession. Now, when I say profession, I mean the idea that you have people who are specifically qualified in something to carry out tasks or projects. Urban planning itself has been around for thousands of years, as long as cities have existed. But this was done until very recently, mainly by architects, monarchs, or dictators. The notion that you would have people dedicated to the art and science of making and changing human settlements has really only come up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In Australia and much of the Western world at least, planning hasn't been recognised as a separate discipline until the early 1900s. The first urban planning course at a university wasn't offered until 1909 in Liverpool, and the first planning degree in Australia wasn't in place until 1949 at the South Australian School of Mines and Industries. What this has resulted in is a lack of recognition amongst many people that planning even exists. I remember playing SimCity as a kid and only later, much later, discovering that you could actually work in this field, or that there were studies and a long history behind all this stuff. And I think this ties into the Nth Review's main point about urbanist channels, and how this huge movement has largely failed to result in effective change in North America and elsewhere. Personally, I trace this back to Facebook groups, if you remember those, and mainly the explosion of interest in new urbanist memes for transit-oriented teens, or numtots as it later became known. This, I think, was really the first of what I'll call pop urbanism in this long timeline. What I mean by pop urbanism is basically making the world of planning and cities more accessible and more online. Memes, TikToks, content, all that kind of stuff. I don't use this term in a pejorative way. I'm just trying to describe what I'm talking about. I think this really became the watershed moment for pop urbanism. What numtots really showed us was that there was in fact a huge amount of interest and opinions on urbanist topics. We got all the spin-offs from numtots for specific countries, regions, or cities. For example, Melbourne's was, and still is, Urban Sprawl Memes for Hoddle Grid Teens, which I thought was a pretty good title. This then sowed the seeds for other platforms and people to build on, like many of the urbanist YouTube channels that are popular today. So while I do tend to agree with what he's saying here, I don't think it entirely began with YouTubers. They largely followed up on what happened in numtots and similar groups. For example, someone simply posting a photo of a street in Amsterdam before and after it was changed from a car to a bike and public transport oriented environment. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. As he says, introducing people to concepts and ideas like induced demand, housing, zoning, and other things is a really big step in the right direction, particularly for a profession like ours that generally has a poor understanding amongst the general public. I think there's a lot to be said about these channels, and they deserve a lot of credit for bringing these concepts to the fore and educating a lot of people who otherwise may not have engaged with planning. And I also don't think that all channels should be a manual for local activism. Partly because I think we would miss out on a lot of great content, and partly because local activism and context vary so widely between one place and another. To this, I would like to add a point about geography. Almost all of the urbanist channels that I know of, at least, are from people who are or were from the United States or Canada. Most of the rest, like Building Beautifully and Tate Set, I know of because they're from Australia. But really, when you look at what's going on around the world, there are very few creators with the reach of channels like Not Just Bikes or Oh the Urbanity that are from countries that are not in North America. I think this is a shame because there's so much else going on out there, all across South America, Africa, and Asia especially. Not that I don't think that what these existing channels are doing isn't cool and good, or that it's really their fault. I just want to highlight that we're missing out on perspectives from other people as well. This comes back to my point earlier about local context. While there are a lot of transplantable concepts about community engagement and affecting change, the huge differences between how countries, regions, or even individual settlements operate means that you really need content made locally to be effective. Even concepts that may seem pretty basic, like having a city government that is responsible for public transport, or having a city government at all, do not apply in many places. For example, in the US, most cities operate their own bus networks, whereas here in Victoria, we don't really have city governments at all. And what local government we do have certainly don't operate public transport, except for some community buses. The laws, history, and circumstances are quite different no matter where you go. What may be effective in your town, city, or country may in fact be completely the wrong thing to do somewhere else. And this is why I think having local content is one of the most important things here if we're talking about affecting change. Finally, I would like to add a note about something that the Nth Review and City Nerd touched on in their videos on this topic: why almost all urbanist YouTubers do not work in this field. In Australia at least, and I suspect this is similar across the world, by its very nature, most planners work at some level of government. Here it's somewhere around 70 or 75%. And most of the rest work in private consultancies, where they rely on getting work from governments. What this means is that either as a bureaucrat or someone with a livelihood that otherwise depends on you being paid by the government restricts what you can say in public or online. Of course, this applies to anyone with this situation, not just planners, but I think planning finds itself in a unique position, where almost the entire profession depends on work in the public sector, and with something as inherently political as cities and urbanism. I'm not making a comment here on whether this is a good or bad thing, by the way. This is just why I think we see hardly any currently practicing planners making content on platforms like YouTube. And to come back to the point about why there isn't more context around activism in urbanist YouTube channels, I think this is a huge part of it. As government workers, we can't go out there and advocate for or against something which we're involved in. That would be an obvious conflict of interest. And again, I really don't want this to come across like I'm gatekeeping planning or something. Having input from non-planners is really important and I absolutely welcome it. But it's equally important to have people who work in this every single day involved in the conversations. And I don't just mean planners, by the way, but also activists and other people who work in related fields like transport engineering. There are some notable exceptions here, City Nerd being one, and he does some terrific work. But by and large, there is a big gap here that I think needs to be filled. By the same token, you absolutely do not need to be a planner or have a deep understanding of everything in order to do something useful with the information you learn from urbanist YouTube. I do think you need to know what you're getting yourself into, and also understand key concepts to make sure that your goals and actions are actually going to help. But I also think it's much better for people to just start somewhere. Fair warning though, once you get to know a lot of the planning and transport issues, you will never unsee them. Prepare to just run into these things no matter where you go or what you do. It's a very red pill kind of moment. Planning is already important and will only become more so in the future. So having a better understanding of what's happening is great, and I absolutely welcome that. As City Nerd said in his reaction video, he doesn't want his channel to come across as preachy, and I also totally understand that. We need channels to show us facts and talk about topics in the way that he and others currently do. But to make the most of this, we also need channels to talk about the how and give people the tools to understand and engage with the processes that run our regions, towns, and cities. So I really do appreciate what the Nth Review has done here and for starting this discussion. Hopefully this is the beginning of opening up some new avenues for content where people can engage with these topics at a new level. If you're new here, I make videos on local history and transport, mainly focused on Melbourne. If that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to check out my channel and maybe even subscribe if you'd like. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.